Ladies and gentlemen, good morning, and welcome to what promises to be a fabulous conversation with the Managing Director of the IMF, Madame Christine Lagarde. My name is Eric Farnsworth. I head the Washington office of the Council of the Americas and the Americas Society. Honored to be your host today. Thank you for coming and joining us. Normally, we ask everybody in our audiences to turn off your cell phones. Today, we ask you to turn them on. We are encouraging tweeting. We are encouraging live conversation. And the hashtag that we are promoting is Road to Lima, hashtag Road to Lima. Our symbol is @ASCOA, in case you care to use that. With that, let me please invite our chairman of the Americas Society and Council of the Americas, Ambassador John Negroponte, to the podium to introduce our speaker and to conduct the conversation today. Ladies and gentlemen, Ambassador John Negroponte.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you, Eric. On behalf of the Council of the Americas, I'm honored to introduce the Managing Director of the International Monetary Fund, Christine Lagarde. We're very grateful that she's joined us today. We much appreciate your presence. As you know, Madame Lagarde became head of the IMF in 2011 after serving as France's finance minister and previously Minister of Agriculture for a brief stint and Minister of Foreign Trade. As the first woman to hold the finance minister post not only in France but in any of the G8 countries, she played a pivotal role in responding to the global financial crisis and the European debt crisis. The Financial Times voted her the best finance minister in Europe, and her steady leadership at the helm of the organization that serves 188 countries continues to earn plaudits around the globe. In her 4 years as managing director, Madame Lagarde has worked diligently to improve the IMF's relations with emerging market economies and to consolidate international cooperation on reducing inequality and enhancing female labor participation, among many other issues. This coming up October, Madame Lagarde will travel to Lima, Peru, this year's host of the annual meetings of the IMF and the World Bank Group. Lima will be the first Latin American city to host this event in 48 years. Now, ladies and gentlemen, please assist me in welcoming Managing Director of the International Monetary Fund, Christine Lagarde.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Ambassador, for those greetings and for your kind comments. Good morning to all of you. Congratulations for having managed the rain, the traffic, and all these other things that you had to do, and for being here today. I have to say that it's very fitting, Mr. Ambassador, that I appear before this black curtain in this beautiful setting that you've organized, given that this is actually the curtain raising speech on behalf of the IMF, as we normally do before the annual meeting, which, as you said, will be convened in Lima, Peru, in a few days, and where we have more than 10,000 registered who come from all over the world, from the financial sphere, as well as, of course, from the 188 member countries of the IMF and the World Bank. For those past 50 years, the Council of the Americas has brought together opinion leaders, you, to exchange ideas, to forge relations, to forge solutions as well to Latin America's many challenges over the course of the last 50 years. Your mission is very important today as Latin America is facing serious challenges. Latin America is not alone, so is the world actually. I'm actually concerned about the state of the world affairs. The refugees' influx into Europe is only the latest symptom of sharp political and economic tensions in Northern Africa, in the Middle East. And while this refugee crisis captures attention in the advanced economies, it is by no means an isolated event. Conflicts are raging in many other parts of the world too, and there are at the moment close to 60 million people displaced on a global basis. Another little challenge, let's just not forget that 2015 is very much on a course to being the hottest year on record, with an extremely strong El Niño that has spawned weather-related calamities in the Pacific, and which is of critical interest to countries that depend very much on the fishing industry, like Peru, for instance. On the economic front, there are also reason to be concerned. The prospect of rising interest rates in the United States and China's slowdown are contributing to uncertainty and higher market volatility. There has been a sharp deceleration in the growth of global trade, and the rapid drop in commodity prices is causing problems for most resource-based countries in Latin America and elsewhere. Besides the heartbreaking suffering from conflict and forced migration, there is a human toll from economic dislocation and low activity. More than 200 million people at the moment are actually looking for a job and declaring that they are unemployed. We have more income and wealth inequality. It keeps rising. And women continue to be disadvantaged both in pay, in financial market access, in labor market opportunities. It could be even much worse, some will say. Let us not forget that we have just come out of a major financial crisis a few years ago. And some areas of the world have been doing quite well. For example, think of the many countries in Latin America which over the past 2 decades have transformed themselves economically and socially, bringing a better life to millions of their own citizens in the process. There has been tangible progress in Africa too, and Asia's economic weight has continued to grow tremendously in the recent years. But many of these gains are now under threat, and understandably there is some confusion and concern. I'm asked all the time, is this only, cyclical? Is it structural? Is there something a bit more fundamental going on at the moment? Well, the simple answer is that there is no simple answer to those questions. And my key message today, and I hope to develop that and convince you, is this. With the right policies, with strong leadership, and global cooperation more than ever before, it can be managed. And it was managed in the past. We're talking about low commodity prices and the shock that it has on many of the commodity producing countries. But remember, well, some of you in the room, not all of you, the oil shocks of the 70s, of the 80s. For those of you who are really concerned about the soon-to-be, when, don't ask me, raise in the interest rate by the Fed, remember the end of the Bretton Woods system. And for those who are really concerned about the transition that is clearly taking place in China at the moment, remember not so long ago how the whole of Central and Eastern Europe actually transitioned massively from the Soviet Union to a new era of development and governance. Now, you will say, okay, but today's world is different. Yeah. Demographic pressures, climate change, environmental degradation are more acute now. But there was just as much risk and uncertainty back then, and policymakers did manage to lead the world economy back into calmer waters. And this is what they must do again. I'd like to quote Mario Vargas Llosa, the Peru's Nobel laureate. He once said, and I want to quote in English, I should have used my Spanish. Uncertainty is a daisy whose petals are never fully plucked. Policymakers will pluck some of those petals in the next few days in the meetings they have in Lima. Today what I would like to do is try to pluck a few myself and answer, or try to answer, 3 questions. Where do we stand? What should we do? And how do we make it happen? So on where do we stand, I'm going to try to take you, without bugging you too much with numbers, take you through a tour of the world economy as it is, and focus particularly on some of those transitions that are on the mind of many. Our World Economic Outlook's numbers will be released next week. But what I can really tell you is this. Global growth will likely be weaker this year than last, with only a modest acceleration expected in 2016. Now, the good news is that we are seeing a modest pickup in advanced economies. The moderate recovery is strengthening in the euro area. Japan is returning to positive growth, and activity remains reasonably robust in the United States and also in the UK. The not so good news is that emerging economies are likely to see their 5th consecutive year of declining rates of growth. 5th consecutive year. India remains a bright spot. China is slowing down as it rebalances away from export-led growth. Countries such as Russia or Brazil are facing serious economic difficulties. Growth in Latin American countries in general continues to slow sharply. Now you might ask, low-income countries? Well, it's weaker as well in the low-income countries because they will be increasingly affected by the worsening external environment. At the global level, there is still a drag on the economy because financial stability has not yet been assured. And despite progress in recent years, financial sector weaknesses remain in many countries, and financial risks are now elevated in emerging markets. They have clearly rotated over to the emerging market economies. So if we put all this together, we see global growth that is disappointing and uneven. In addition, and that's a more recent phenomenon, we observe that medium-term growth prospects have also become weaker. For those of you who follow the IMF, I have coined last year not secular stagnation, but new mediocre. And this new mediocre is the risk of low growth, not stagnation, but low growth for an extended period of time. Well, that risk looms closer. Why? Because potential growth is being held back by low productivity, by population aging, by the legacies of the global financial crisis, which have not all been addressed and fixed. High debt, low investment, and weak banks continue to burden advanced economies. Not all of them, but certainly quite a few of them in Europe. And many emerging economies continue to face adjustments after their post-crisis credit and investment boom. Let's now turn a little bit the focus on some of those transitions that are much talked about. Because this outlook, however possibly mediocre it is, could certainly be affected by major economic transitions. We call them, in our jargon, the spillovers and the spillbacks. Spillovers is when policies or situations have actually external effects. They go outside of the domestic markets. The spillback is when, as a result of those spillovers, there is a shift back to where the shock initially came from. So I'm going to focus on two particular transitions that can actually have those spillovers and spillback effects. One is China transition to a new model, and the second one is the normalization of US monetary policy. And just as an aside, I just want you to understand that those two transitions are healthy and necessary. But they are transitions. They're healthy and necessary, and they're good for China, they're good for the United States, they're good for the global economy as well. But the challenge is to actually manage them efficiently so that they can unleash as much good as possible. Let's first look at China. China is in the midst of a fundamental and welcome transformation, one that has been called for, expected by many. It has launched deep structural reforms to lift incomes and living standards of the Chinese population. These reforms will, by design, lead to a new normal of slower, safer, more sustainable growth. That's what Chinese leaders generally associate with quality over quantity growth. Slower, safer, more sustainable. The new model relies more on consumption and less so on commodity-intensive investment. More on services, less on manufacturing. So it's a double transition as well. It also requires transitioning to a stable, more market-driven financial system, third transition element. In other words, China's policymakers are facing a very delicate balancing act. They need to implement these difficult reforms, which they have embarked upon with the political determination to stay the course, while at the same time preserving demand and financial stability. As I said, this kind of transition can create spillover effects through the traditional channels, trade, not only trade, exchange rates, as we have seen, asset markets, as we witnessed in the summer, and capital flows, as has been experienced. We saw some of that this summer. Investors were worried about the speed at which China's economy was slowing. These concerns, the investors' concerns, put further pressure on commodity markets and triggered sizable currency depreciation in a number of commodity exporters, particularly in Latin America. Because those countries for many years have relied upon China as an export destination. Just as an example, China consumes about 60% of iron ore in the world, 60%. But of course, as it invests less, China is going to purchase less of those commodities. This will, in our view, contribute to what could very well be a prolonged period of commodity prices that will be lower. A change that indeed needs to be managed by policymakers, particularly in large commodity exporting countries. That's for China. Let's have a quick look at the US normalization of monetary policy. The Federal Reserve is poised to raise interest rates for the first time in 9 years. Although the Fed has also clearly indicated that rates are expected to remain low for some time. But this transition is good. It reflects better economic circumstances in the US, which is good for this country, but it's also good for the economy at large. What did low interest rates produce for a long period of time? Well, they certainly contributed to a search for yield on the part of investors, which supported financial risk-taking and higher valuations of some equities around the world, much talked about today, sovereign bonds, and corporate credit. So the Fed, too, has a delicate balancing act to negotiate. It needs to normalize interest rates while minimizing the risk of financial market disruption. And again, there are potential spillovers. The prospect of rising US rates has already contributed to higher financing costs for some borrowers, including in emerging and developing countries. But this is part of a necessary adjustment in global financial conditions. Now, is it going to be absolutely smooth? There will be spillover effects, and there might be spillover effects in particular if structural changes complicate the matter. In the fixed income markets, for instance, which have become less liquid and more fragile, which could be a good recipe for market overreactions and disruptions. Now, with those spillover risks on the horizon, what is the situation in many of these economies that could be affected by the spillovers? Well, outside the advanced economies, countries are generally better prepared for higher interest rates than they were in the past. Yet, we are concerned about their capacity to buffer shocks, because they have used quite a bit of their buffers. Many emerging and developing countries responded to the global financial crisis with bold counter-cyclical fiscal and monetary actions. By using these policy buffers at the time, in the 2008-2009, they were able to lead their countries out of the crisis and certainly to lead the global economy as well. Because over the past 5 years, if you remember which countries actually drove growth in the world, it was about 80% emerging market economies and low-income countries. These policies generally went together with an increase in financial leverage in the private sector. Hence, corporates in those countries increased their indebtedness. And many countries themselves have incurred more debt, significant portion of which is in US dollars. There are quite a few African countries that have actually decided to issue in foreign denominated currencies that they had not done before, which are going to be exposed to those financial changes. The bottom line to all that is that proactive policy management by everyone, especially in the emerging economies, is now more important than ever. All of that was our diagnosis of what is happening. What should be done about it? While the transitions underway carry a downside risk, we know that this can be managed. It has been managed in the past. How can it be so? Well, first of all, by supporting demand using both monetary and fiscal policy, by preserving and enhancing financial stability, and by implementing structural reforms. I don't think many economists would actually disagree with that recipe. I would like to be a bit more specific today. As I noted earlier, policy action is required now, and we need to intensify our policy efforts. What we have in mind is something that I could refer to as a policy upgrade. Not the normal course of business, an upgrade to our policies. On the demand side, most advanced economies, except one of these days the United States and probably soon to follow the United Kingdom, will continue to require accommodative monetary policies. All advanced economies, though, should fully incorporate spillover risks in their decision-making process. Fully incorporate the spillover risks in their decision-making process. And ensure that their communications are very clear in this regard. This constitutes a crucial policy upgrade. And it's only a recognition of the fact that so many emerging and low-income countries, developing countries, are playing a key role in the global economy and in the growth process and are playing a key role at spilling back the spillover effects that they themselves receive. The euro area can upgrade also by fully tackling non-performing loans that we estimate are worth about 900 billion euros. This is, by the way, one of the major legacies of the financial crisis that is still sitting in some corners of banks in some countries in the euro area. By removing these non-performing loans that have built up, banks would be more able to increase the supply of credit to companies, to households. It would give full potency to the monetary policy of the European Central Bank, probably improve the outlook and bolster market confidence. That's an upgrade. Emerging economies would need to improve the monitoring of foreign currency exposure of major corporates. They should also use macroprudential tools to ensure the resilience of banks vis-à-vis the build-up of corporate leverage and foreign debt, in order to contribute to financial stability and reduce the risk of negative feedback loop between corporate banks sovereign. At the global level, there is a pressing need to complete and implement the financial regulatory reform agenda, with a special focus on improving the transparency and oversight of non-banks or shadow banks. And we still have another major upgrade ahead of us, the resolution framework for systemic, globally active financial institutions, because it still today remains inadequate. That's predominantly on the monetary and financial side. If we look at the fiscal side now, countries should use policies that are as flexible and as growth-friendly as possible. The IMF recommends that advanced economies with room for fiscal stimulus use it to boost public investment, especially in quality infrastructure or maintenance thereof. This is for the short term. What is needed in the medium term as well, and particularly for countries like the United States and Japan, is a credible medium-term fiscal plan that anchors fiscal discipline. Commodity exporting countries, those that have policy room to maneuver, should use it to smoothen their adjustment to those lower commodity prices that we see as a regular feature. Others that do not have that same space should rely on growth-friendly fiscal rebalancing, including tax reforms, energy pricing reforms, and reprioritizing spending in order to protect, in particular, the most vulnerable. What about the upgrade in fiscal? Well, we believe that fiscal rules, if they're respected, can actually help balance, again, another balancing act, credibility with the necessary flexibility. Commodity exporters such as Colombia, such as Norway, such as Botswana, have used the commodity boom to strengthen their fiscal frameworks against shocks. So what have they done? In the good days, well, they have secured some buffers so that for the rainy days, they can use that. This has put them in a position where they can actually better determine the pace of necessary fiscal adjustment and therefore preserve growth for the future. That's a good lesson for others to eventually use. Finally, and that's a common factor to pretty much all economies at the moment, all countries need to upgrade their economic structures through reforms in market and labor, through labor and product market, infrastructure, education, healthcare, and trade, to only name a few. All good and well. So we understand the diagnosis. We understand what needs to be done, depending on what resources are available, what stage of development countries are. But how does it happen? because it's easy to make policy recommendations. It's far more complicated to actually implement them and have the political savviness and the urge to implement, especially in the face of lower growth and high uncertainty. What's quite fascinating at the moment is that those policies are not only required at the country level for the domestic markets, but they need to also be coordinated at the international levels, because as we saw the spillovers and the spillbacks, in the same vein, policy decisions made in a particular market are going to have an impact elsewhere. Just think about the issues. Trade has been declining. Well, a lot of the international trade agreements need an impulse, need a push. Think about climate change. Yes, it is true that if you take measures locally, it's going to have an impact on your economy, but it has to be done at a global level. Think about migration. It needs to be addressed at multiple levels and at an international level for sure. Think about the global financial safety net. It's okay to accumulate some reserves, but it's not a particularly useful way to protect oneself. It's much better to have a well-coordinated, well-oiled international financial safety net. So all of that requires increased international cooperation. I have to say that, I know, Ambassador, you'll have to be in New York later this afternoon. I was in New York in the last few days for the Sustainable Development Goals endorsement. And there was a bit of that spirit. We are facing those issues together. We need to take the necessary action to implement the right policies to actually achieve those 17 Sustainable Development Goals, not just at low-income countries level, but everywhere. Let's hope that that same spirit of international cooperation is at play as well in early December when they all meet in Paris for COP21 and they appreciate the international impact of climate change and how their decision is going to have an impact for all populations. Let's look at the refugee crisis that I referred to earlier. Very much and very high on the mind of all Europeans. Well, again, as much as a humanitarian crisis, it is also an economic challenge that affects all of them and all of us, I would say, and one where everybody has to try to help finding solutions. Now, we will do our best to play our part. We are analyzing the economic impact on our affected members, economic impact of all those components that I've just mentioned, and we will provide specific policy recommendations. Just to take the example of this refugee situation, I'll give you an example of how we do what we can where we can. We have programs in place with countries like Jordan, Iraq, Tunisia. Well, we did change the fiscal space in those programs in order to help those countries actually face the millions of refugees that flock to their countries in order to find a safe haven. Now, with our mandate to address growth and economic stability issues at the national and global level, we also continue to refine our traditional activities: surveillance, lending, and capacity building. And we are adapting to further strengthen our support for our membership as they face those ongoing transitions that I've just outlined. Just to give you an example again, we provide a lot of technical assistance and a lot of capacity building support to the membership. Well, guess what? What is very much in demand at the moment is how do we transition away from a fiscal space where we have subsidized the use of energy? How do we move out of that while protecting the most exposed? Difficult transition, where certainly we can help as well. So that's what I mean by our institution adapting. And at the IMF, we love to coin principles and we use those letters. Now, luckily, those 3 letters that I have in mind to make sure that the IMF adapts forms a word which is called AIM. A for agile, I for integrated advice, and M for member-focused. And that's really what our institution is going to try to continue to improve. Not to say that we are just discovering agility, integration of advice, and focus on membership. But I think that given the changing circumstances that the world is facing, that the policymakers are facing, the courage and the energy that it's going to require to actually implement those changes, we need to be as responsive as ever to their request. And we'll elaborate much further on these aims that we have in my annual address to our 188 members who will be meeting in Lima next week. But let me add one thing, and I'm afraid that I'm going to sound, for those of you who come regularly to this particular exercise, I'm going to sound like a broken record. Because to be effective, we need the full support of our entire membership, as much as our membership should be properly mirrored and reflected in the composition of the institution. And therefore, the adoption of the 2010 quota and governance reforms is essential for us and for the international community to actually reflect that international community and operate with the full support, including of the first member of the institution, which is the United States of America. So I continue to urge ratification by the US Congress as quickly as possible of a reform that was adopted in 2010, which should have been completed in 2012, and which is still lagging behind because the United States has not ratified that reform. I think it would be totally in line with the important role that the United States has always played at the IMF, and it is quite simply indispensable if the world is to effectively manage these transitions and have available the resources and the authority that can only result from an institution that properly reflects the evolution of the world and is sufficiently strong in its financials in order to respond to difficult situations. I'm going to conclude with one gentleman who was one of the 2 founders of the IMF, at least conceptually and intellectually, together with Dexter White. And he's John Maynard Keynes. Now, flashback, it was in the midst of the Great Depression, not recession, depression. He wrote, "It is common to hear people say that the epoch of enormous economic progress is over. But I believe that it's a wildly mistaken interpretation of what is happening to us. We are suffering not from the rheumatics of old age, but from the growing pains of over-rapid changes, from the painfulness of readjustment between one economic period and another." Keynes' note of realism and optimism proved to be right, of course. And I believe it is fitting to finish on that note. Yes, there is uncertainty. Yes, the challenges are great. And yes, with the right policies, leadership and cooperation, we can manage to a brighter future and deal with those challenges and uncertainties. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Madame Lagarde, for that very interesting and wide-ranging discussion. And again, I want to reiterate that we're delighted that you were able to address this audience on the eve of your trip to Lima for the annual IMF World Bank meeting. So I will perhaps ask 1 or 2 questions and then open it up to the audience. But I suppose my principal question would be, given the fact that these meetings will be taking place in Lima, Peru, do you have a particular message for the Western Hemisphere and for the Latin American countries as a region?
Well, first of all, I think it's telling that we are meeting there for the first time in almost 50 years. Mm-hmm. And I think it's an indication of the importance of the emerging market economies on the global scene. It's also an indication for us, vis-à-vis the Western Hemisphere, that they matter a lot to the IMF, and we want to be right there with them. Now, in terms of what we want to convey, I think it's going to be twofold. One is many of them, but certainly more so the likes of Venezuela, Colombia, Chile, are facing the hardship of much lower commodity prices. And that has been the case for the last few years when it comes to metals, more recently when it comes to oil. But that has been the hardship within which they've operated. And clearly, all the upgrades that I've mentioned earlier, whether it's on the monetary front, whether it's on the fiscal front, or whether it's on the structural reform front, they have to embrace all these upgrades, and they have to ask themselves, with our support, of course, if they so want it, which ones of those are going to be most efficient for my current situation? Because they're not each, although many of them are facing the same reality of lower commodity prices, some of them have taken significant reforms. That would be the case for Mexico, for instance. Some of them had taken precautions. That would be the case of Colombia. Others are facing a variety of problems in addition to the economic issues, and that is certainly the case for Brazil. But I would say that for most of them, they really have to restore a degree of credibility, a degree of certainty in what they're going to drive in terms of changes, and also focus on what diversification they want to either develop if they have already started, or implement, because it's clearly called by the current situation.
Mm-hmm. Maybe I could just finally come back to the issue you mentioned about the U.S. Congress and the pending reform, and looking at it a bit from a geopolitical point of view, which is my greater area of knowledge and expertise. But it seems to me, and Dr. Kissinger, I think, has written some very interesting recent work on the whole question of the global order. And you talk about the founding days of the Bretton Woods institutions and when these entities were created 50 years ago. And it was part, really, of Franklin Roosevelt's and Winston Churchill's and others' view that we didn't want to see a repetition of what happened after World War I. We wanted to create a world order that was inclusive, that there was buy-in even from the defeated countries. And it seems to me, in some sense, we're back up against this kind of question today, and we're having difficulty in our minds, I'm speaking now as an American, trying to figure out how this new rising country, China, is going to fit in the global order. And it seems to me that logic would suggest that we have to try to adopt a more inclusive attitude, and which is, in effect, what this reform of the capital system of the IMF, and I don't think it even goes necessarily that very far. It's not an extreme measure by any chance. But I guess my question to you would be, the so-called Asian infrastructure and investment in infrastructure bank that China has created and so forth, if we don't get these reforms, do you see some risk that countries such as China or the BRICS or others might be tempted to try and develop some alternative international system? So I guess your reflections on this this rather sort of macro issue.
Well, thank you so much, because I think that's a very, very pertinent question, and the world order by Professor Kissinger was certainly a great perspective from which to see how those institutions have seen the light of day in right after the Second World War, were actually thought through in 1944, as the war was not yet over. I would first observe that those rising power, and clearly China is one, want to play by the rules of the game. And I'm only speaking from my IMF window. I'm not talking cyberspace issues, intellectual property rights, and so on and so forth. But as far as participating in the economic, financial, international community, there is a keen determination and a strong willingness on their part to be in that sphere, to play by the rules, to be an active and engaged member, and to take responsibility. So that's my first observation. Second observation, in that forum, as in a few others, their representation, their participation, their voice, their percentage in the voting environment is clearly not tantamount to their space on the global economy.
It's not proportionate.
No, it's not. I mean, by market measures, they are the second largest economy in the world. By PPP, they are the first economy in the world. And it's just a bit mind-boggling to see what percentage of vote and voices they have in the institution. So difficult not to have a sense of frustration.
Their vote? What is their percentage of vote?
It's less than 6%. Okay. And the US is 17%. So that gives an idea of the sort of need to rebalance. And the third observation that I would make is that the setting up of these AIIB, the swap line arrangement, those various projects is almost, a backup option, as well as being an initiative in and of themselves. I think the Asian International Investment Bank is something which is going to have a life of its own, which has been welcomed by many, which many countries are participating in, and there are so many infrastructure projects around the world anyway that to actually harness the financing and develop those products is certainly a good idea. But it is also, in a way, as a result of, I would suppose, a degree of frustration with things not happening despite the first observation that I made, which is, willingness to play by the rules. Right. I would just also, I'm old enough to remember the days when, I lived in this country in 73, 74, and the great uncle in the family was always talking about the Japs. That, he had his own history. Right. But I then became an intellectual lawyer, not expert, intellectual property young expert. I turned away from being an expert many years ago. But we were very focused in those days on the attempt by some countries and some fellows to imitate, copy, take photos of things. Well, 20 years later, I was still in the field of law. They were probably the most active to insist on protection of property rights, of intellectual property rights, and extremely engaged in forging international webs in order to protect that. So progress happens, evolution is part of our game.
I fully agree with that. So I would like to turn to the audience for their questions, and I don't know whether there's a mic that will be passed around. All right, right there, the gentleman there, and I suppose if you could stand up and identify yourself before asking your question, and I would respectfully request that these be questions.
Thank you very much for the outstanding presentation. Madame Lagarde, my name is Alfonso Diaz, incidentally, a non-performing economist, you might call me that. With regards to Latin America, you or maybe I misunderstood, let it know that there might be the need for the old-fashioned IMF adjustments, by that meaning increasing taxes on energy pricing, by that meaning increasing the price of energy and utilities. Could you elaborate on that? I just happened to have a vacation in Greece a 3 weeks ago, and trust me, I didn't like the 23% tax. I had my mind in Connecticut where we paid 6%. Thank you.
Well, who likes to pay tax? You don't, I don't, nobody does. Let me just, you referred to energy tax, right? Energy price increase. I think we have a particular line at the IMF, and we have now published reasonably extensively on that in particular, because we take the view that it is not a particularly useful, it's not a very productive use of public spending to actually subsidize the use of fossil fuel. So we are advocating that countries should gradually transition out of subsidizing fossil energy, which as a result indeed raises the price of energy. For those countries that already tax the use of energy, that's a different story. But for those that subsidize energy, we do say that subsidies should be moved out gradually over time, and prices should therefore be hiked, which is reasonably convenient when you do that at a time when the price of oil is rather low. The key thing, and I think the proof of the determination will be demonstrated in the course of time if oil prices were to rise again, as to whether or not those subsidies are definitely eliminated or do not, sneak back through the back door. So we are definitely recommending that. We're not suggesting that it be done in a very abrupt and brutal way. We're suggesting that transitioning out over time is a better way to do it. And we're also saying that the people that are most exposed to the risk of price rise be actually protected, but through a different system, not using subsidies, using cash transfers, using those smart cards, capping in a way and focusing and targeting where that public spending is actually expended. It's a fact in most countries that 80% of the public money that goes into subsidy for energy actually goes to people who do not effectively need it. And those 20% that need the subsidies, they have to receive support, cash equivalent, cash transfers in order to cope with the transitioning. So on that front, we are very clear, and I think it's the IMF contribution also to the climate change issues. Good use of public money should not be in subsidizing fossil energy. In the same vein, we provide technical assistance and we support those countries that are trying to determine a price for carbon and to eventually tax carbon as a result. We believe that this is a necessary step going forward because otherwise you just don't take externalities into account and the price of what you're selling is just not the right price.
Since we started a few minutes late, would it be all right to go 5 minutes over the time?
5 minutes, Ambassador.
Okay, a couple of more questions.
Can't say no
and
to
the
you.
gentleman over there. Please, again, tell us your name and before you state your question. There's the microphone.
Thank you, sir. Stan. Yeah. Thank you. John Gizzi, Chief Political Correspondent for Newsmax and Newsmax Television. Madam Lagarde, I have covered the last 3 times you made the very forceful case for your IMF reforms to Congress. Every time
I knew I sounded like a broken record to you, at least.
No, I don't. Every time I report it, and every time I get a hostile response from Republican members of Congress, many of whom say they will not give up the power, and then they always add they really don't know you or haven't met you. I know you met with Senator Menendez. Can you tell any of the Republicans you've met, and with the Republican leadership changing in the House, do you have plans to meet with the eventual successors to Speaker Boehner and other leaders?
I don't think that I have spared efforts in the last 3 years to actually make the case, to be as convincing as I can, and to describe for those who are skeptics that the IMF role is very important, that it's not costly at all, that it actually brings revenue back to the budget of those who lend when it happens. And the IMF has paid back a lot of money to the US Treasury over the course of years, that it's actually conducive to a more stable global economy, which is itself a good for the US economy and those who export, trade, operate with the rest of the world, and that the US was a founding member, is the largest shareholder in the institution, has a veto right over many of the qualified majority decisions, will keep its veto right as a result of the reform, and I think needs to be active in a forum which organizes rather than disrupts economic international relationships. So it was reported by the press, so I don't mind saying that, but this afternoon I'll be visiting the Senate Foreign Affairs Committee on various matters, and I will not spare that occasion to try to make my case again.
Very good. All right, the gentleman over there.
Hi, my name is Andrei Sitov. I'm with the Russian news agency TASS, and I was going to ask you exactly about your presentation today at the Senate committee. Thank you for the comprehensive presentation on the world economy, and thank you to the organizers for hosting this. My question is about Ukraine and Russia. Obviously, you will be briefing them on Ukraine, so I understand you cannot go into detail, but what is the overall message that you will be bringing to the senators? And specifically, there is an issue of the Russian loan. Have you had your lawyers look into that matter, and what can you advise? Thank you.
Well, I think it will be one of the various topics that we will be discussing, because while clearly we are spending quite a lot of energy, brain power, and money as well, trying to help the Ukrainian economy restore stability and provide an environment that is conducive to better life for its people. We are also busy with a few other places around the world. So I will be addressing all their questions. And on Ukraine, certainly I will explain exactly what the IMF program does, what numerous reforms the Ukrainian authorities have put in place, what fiscal discipline has been observed so far, and I will describe for them as well how necessary these reforms are and how necessary it is to stay the course and to make sure that the economy can continue to stabilize rather than be disrupted.
So we take one final question from the gentleman right here.
Thank you. Victor Rodriguez. Madame Lagarde, you mentioned briefly Mexico. Mexico has been following more or less the by-the-book rules of making reforms, having a much better taking care economy. But at the same time, Mexico is suffering now exchange rate issues. Of course, commodities like oil is affecting over there. But do you think that this can create the image that even with the reforms, the things cannot go as well as should be?
No, absolutely. Thank you. No. And I think that when we analyze the situation of Mexico, we certainly see a flurry of very significant reforms that have been undertaken. Whether you look at as you mentioned, the energy, telecommunication, education, fiscal, there have been really a lot of fronts that have been tackled by the Mexican authorities, and very courageously. Now, these reforms are now beginning to enter into effect and to be implemented. I mean, there was that legislative space, which has taken the last year and a half or so, and now implementation begins. So I think we're going to begin to see the impact it really has on the economy. I would add that in terms of energy in particular, and the opening of licenses and the equitization of the energy sector, it's not been the best circumstances for the Mexican authorities, clearly. And they have decisively stayed the course and continue the reforms. And I think, if only that, the determination to continue the reforms and to implement will likely contribute to confidence building. Because, you know, I spoke earlier in my presentation about the fiscal rule. Well, the fiscal rule is only as good as it's embedded and implemented. And you know, to actually prove that will go a long way into solidifying confidence.
So, contributing to the health of the global economy is not exactly an easy task, particularly in uncertain times like these, with so much going on around the world, many of which issues you alluded to during your remarks, Madame Lagarde. So we want to respect our admiration and respect for what you do, and also your thanks for being here with us this morning. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.